And the first one up will be Lauren Hooten, who is a PhD candidate from Trent.
Is that the flicker? Yes. Is it this button? Yes. Oh, that's fine. Yeah. All right, cool. So today I'm going to be talking about some work that a whole bunch of us did over the span of many years. And it was published in CJZ last year, but it's looking at the effects of white nose syndrome on hibernating bats and swarming aggregations of bats. All right, so I think a lot of people already know, but swarming is the behavior that 5 of the species we have here in Ontario, they engage in the late summer and into fall, where they congregate at these sites, such as you'll see the Renfrew mine there on the left. Usually they're caves or abandoned mines, and they tend to congregate there mainly for mating, but it's possible that they're also using this time to show young of the year where potential future hibernation sites are, and or just, hanging out on the landscape, who knows? But it's mainly mating, and then you see that a lot of them will stick around and will end up hibernating at these same sites throughout the winter. And unfortunately, it's these bats that, I should point, that engage in hibernation are the ones that have been most affected by white nose syndrome. Obviously, I don't need to rehash the whole story, but long story short, this fungus arrived in New York State in 2006, and then it has continued to spread throughout hibernating bat populations since then. And in the first few years after it first arrived, there were extreme declines in bat populations wherever this fungus was reaching into. And so much so that a lot of researchers predicted that there would be local extinctions of some species, including the ones that had previously been the most common, like the little brown bat that you see there. And so as it continued to spread, this led the Canadian government to list 3 of our species as federally endangered. So Myotis lufugus, the little brown bat, Myotis septentrionalis, or the northern long-eared, and Perimyotis subflavus, which is the tricolored bat. And so in Ontario, white nose was officially confirmed in a hibernacula in the winter of 2009 to 2010. And since that was well over a decade ago now, all the bats in Ontario have now been exposed to the fungus. And initially, as the fungus arrived at these sites, it was the same sort of initial doom, where massive die-offs, up to 100% in some cases at some hibernation sites, resulted from this. And again, people were super worried, obviously, with great understanding, but the story that we see now, several years later, is not quite so clear. So for our objectives, we had a really unique opportunity in that we had people that had been monitoring hibernation sites in Ontario since before white nose was officially arrived, and then also people that had been doing bat surveys at a swarming site in Eastern Ontario for decades. So we had data from Brock Fenton's thesis data in the 1960s, and then Phantom Lab data from in the mid-2000s, and then more recently, the Davy Lab has been doing swarming surveys all at the same site. So using the hibernation data, we could start to evaluate the trends in bat abundance for those hibernating, and then also look at the capture rates at the swarming site to get an idea of the abundance of swarming species. So first of all, for our hibernacula surveys, we had 10 sites in southern Ontario. These were monitored off and on between 2009 and 2015. And a few of those sites we've actually been able to go back to more recently to get more recent numbers for those sites. And then one site in northern Ontario, where white nose didn't reach northern Ontario until a few years after southern Ontario, but this site had been monitored since 2009. And so when we go in, we see Aidan here modeling the gear, the fashion forward, in that we always wore the correct PPE. This has always been a thing with white nose, you want to decontaminate. And then after COVID arrived, we also started wearing N95 masks and the gloves as well. And we would go in, usually in smaller groups, because we don't want to be too disruptive to the hibernating bats. Go in once a year for a maximum of 2 hours. And if might be able to see some of the bats on the ceiling there. If they were in small groups, we would just count those immediately. But if they were in really large clusters, we would take photos and then count them later on the computer, so we weren't spending hours at this site. For our swarming survey, again, we see Renfrew Mine there. We would put, in the more recent years, we've been putting a large harp trap across that entrance there. And the bats fly in, and they're nicely caught there, as you see, waiting to be processed. But we had the 3 sampling periods, so that 1960s period when Brock Fenton was doing his PhD stuff, and then a few of us in the Fenton lab in the mid-2000s were also doing surveys. And having this great range of data has enabled us to be able to look at any changes that we might see in the species that are caught at that site, up to 5 potential species, but if there's any changes in the proportions of those species over time. Also, we could look at relative capture rates. This involved having to know sampling effort, though, which we did to the best of our ability, with the caveat, though, that there were very different capture methods in those different time periods. So recently, again, we used the giant harp trap. In the mid-2000s, we used slightly smaller harp traps. And then in the 1960s, Brock just used his hands and a hand net and mist nets. So it's hard to really quantify what that effort is in comparison to a harp trap, but we did our best. We just couldn't do any official stats with those capture rates. So what do we see? So first of all, if we look at the hibernation count data. So this here is a graph that on the y-axis we have the total number of bats. And I should say that when we did these hibernation surveys, we weren't trying to get to species because we were just trying to get in and out as quickly as possible. So we were just counting total bats. And we can assume that a lot of these are probably little brown bats. But so in the first year, in 2009, white-nose hadn't hit these sites yet. You can see, though, the red dotted lines are when white-nose arrived. So 2010 for the southern sites, and then 2016 for that one northern site. So some of these sites had over tens of thousands of bats, and then within a year had dropped down to under 2,000. And the smaller sites had dropped down to pretty much none. But it's slightly easier to see if we think of it in terms of percentage. So if we think of the first year that we did surveys as 100% capacity of bats, and then the percent decline in subsequent years. You can see, for example, that on the, is this the, no. All right, well, on the, where the second white-nose symbol arrival line is, that's the northern site, where white-nose arrived several years later, but again, had the same effect, and up to an 87% decline within a couple of years for that site. But yeah, 91 to 100% decline in those other sites. However, those few sites that we've been able to start going back to in recent years, we see that the numbers are slowly starting to creep back up again. We're not anywhere near the tens of thousands that we were seeing before, but there is some hope there that there's potentially a slow recovery of those species that are hibernating. And if we look at the capture rates for the swarming site, again, we'll see so the proportion of, so for each species, this is the proportion of the total captures in the night, of the proportion they made up. So little brown bats, we'll look at first, they were in all 3 sampling periods, which are denoted by the different colors, but then also the bar lines there are the mean proportions for each sampling period, and that's what we compared statistically. But there was a range within the years within those periods. But they were still usually above 90% of what we catch at that site in all 3 sampling periods, with the slight exception of the mid-2000s. This was before white-nose arrived at these sites. But we do see a lower proportion of little browns at that time. The northern long-eared bat, it was the second most frequently caught bat at the site in the 1960s and in the mid-2000s, but unfortunately, more recently, we rarely catch this bat now. The northern long-eared was significantly lower in proportion. It's now the least caught bat at this site. Eastern small-footed bats were sort of sort of steady, like always kind of present at the sites in the first 2 sampling periods, and now we're catching a significantly larger number of these bats at the swarming site. Similar with tricolored bats, although there are significantly more of them now as in proportion compared to other sampling times, but them and big browns here, the Aptesticus, are fairly rare, thank you, at this site. So we can't draw huge, robust conclusions for those bats. But if we think of in terms of the sampling effort, so the captures per trap hour, those relative capture rates, again, it just sort of draws similar conclusions to the proportions, in that we see little brown bats had that lower sampling or lower capture rate in the mid-2000s. Again, that's before white nose officially arrived, but this coincidentally is also when wind energy really started to pick up in Ontario, so potentially that could have been starting to have an impact on the little browns at that time. But then if we look at the last few years, when we've gone back, we see that the capture rates are now getting back to what they were in the 1960s. Fortunately, though, again, long-eared bats, rarely caught. Maybe one a year is what we catch there. But the libii, they are being caught a lot more frequently. Same with tricoloreds and Aptesticus, but again, somewhat rare for those species at this site. So what does that tell us? So the hibernation data that we have, we again saw that initial sharp decline that was seen elsewhere in North America as the fungus was being spread. But this sort of recent, hopefully apparent increase is supporting the hypothesis that the survivors from white nose might be resistant to the fungus. And specifically in little brown bats. So on the swarming sites, the recent capture levels that we have are near to those historical levels. Again, we've been doing those surveys now since 7 years past when white nose arrived, and now over a decade. And yeah, these capture levels are near the historical levels. And this is echoed with other populations in North America that have started to see positive annual growth rates, evidence of potential evolutionary rescue for these ones that have survived white nose. And even though there were these catastrophic predictions at the beginning of white nose, for this species at least, we have not seen any full-on regional extinctions of the species. Small-footed bats as well, we've seen an increase in captures, and some evidence seems to be that they may not be as affected by white nose in the same degree as other species. And this has been seen throughout their range. There's sort of been an increased proportion in some hibernacula and summer sites, and I think Christy's going to be talking about that tomorrow as well. Unfortunately, though, the long-eared bats have not fared so well, although apparently they're doing really well in the zoo, so that's great. But at the swarming site, we have seen dramatic decline in captures since white nose syndrome, and severe declines have been reported throughout their range and actually have become regionally extinct in some areas. And this might be because they have higher fungal loads than any of the other species that we capture. So what does this mean in terms of going forward for the conservation? So we see that there are really varied effects per species for how they are reacting to white nose syndrome. So this means that the strategies that we use going forward for conservation need to be tailored to each species specifically, but this needs us to really understand species-specific population dynamics, which we don't have necessarily a good handle on at the moment. But really, the main message that we all want to get across from this is that long-term population monitoring is essential, and that this should be a standardized thing that is happening across large areas, and that will be essential for the recovery of these species. So with that, I'd like to thank our numerous funders and all the people that helped us, and leave you with the glorious image of myself trying to get into one of those hibernation sites, which can sometimes be slightly tricky, but with that, thanks very much.
Hey, Sarah, because you're right here.
That's why I sat at the front. Thanks, Lauren. That was awesome. Really interesting. curious about the small-footed bats and how you saw that kind of increase. And I don't know as much about small-footed, but it makes me wonder, do you think that there could be kind of like a reset going on where the species that were really decimated by white nose, are down, and that kind of opens up the space for these other bats that maybe weren't as affected? So in this case, the Libii, but that might be happening in other places too. And I wondered if you think that could speak to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we don't know. Like, are they suddenly reproducing more and becoming more numerous on the landscape? Or I think maybe potentially more likely is that they've always been there and we're just noticing them more because they're like, well, we're still here, but the other bats necessarily haven't fared as well. So yeah, I'm not sure. It could be, a combination of those things. I think in a lot of ways they were never direct competitors in terms of like foraging with like the northern long-eared, for example. So I don't think it's necessarily that they were being outcompeted before. It's just maybe that we're seeing them around a bit more.
Is this on? I was wondering if you have any thoughts on why the Libii might not have been affected quite as drastically as some of the other species.
What a handy question, and leads into your own research. That's really great. Well, I think Libii, as you know, they tend to, obviously it's anthropomorphic to say they're aloof, but they have different strategies. They roost in different areas of the cave during hibernation, so they're not as constrained by the temperature ranges that the other bats need to be in when they hibernate. They're much more mobile, as you know, on the ground, and can potentially be mitigating their diet, if they were affected by the fungus, to then go out and forage even during the winter by going into the nooks and crannies. But I think also there haven't been as many studies, I think, about the fungal loads with that species, but I think it doesn't seem to affect them as much. And that may be behavioral and just life strategy based.
You said in the 60s it was like the data was gathered through like just hand capture. Do you think that had any major impacts on like the amount of bats captured? Like, do you think there would be, we'd see any major differences in the data if it was like, I guess, redone in the 60s using modern techniques?
That's a really good question. And I think, because part of me wonders, like, if he had harp traps, would his rates have been way higher than what we are seeing now? But at the same time, I'm always like, man, he got a lot of bats. Like, just like him going in and spending like 8 solid hours every night just going in and catching bats. So maybe that is a fact that there were just way more at that time, or he was just super skilled that he could go and do that. So yeah, it would be an interesting thing to know.
Great presentation. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you think that the fact that we're seeing sort of a bit of recovery now would be justification to say that bats that survive after an exposure to PD are more likely to be resistant to PD in the future, and therefore that those bats might be of particular conservation value as they are showing evidence of having some resistance.
I think definitely, because I think the bats that we have remaining, and especially in southern Ontario where it's been here for a while, those are the ones that are resistant, or they've had it and recovered. So I think we really need to focus on those populations that are remaining and work, in maintaining their summer habitats or anything that can keep those populations going. Because bats have such slow recruitment that it's going to take a while for the populations to get back up to previous levels. So definitely important to help those guys.
Great stuff. Curious if you're going to be doing any tagging and tracking to find roosts within the network for follow-up studies with these resilient bats.
Well, so that actually then what I have been doing the last couple years, or it's been a few years now, but is tagging these bats at swarming sites and then using the MODIS network to see sort of how they're moving around, and also then tagging them at maternity sites to see where they're going to their swarming sites as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, Derek's got one.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a big question that you feel free to weasel around because it's a tough one. So with bats increasing, do you think that white nose is still having any effects on the bats that still exist there?
Thank you, Derek. That was lovely. I mean, I'm not the best person to answer this question. I haven't been doing a lot of the genetic studies. Definitely talk to Christina. But it may be having an effect. I think there's still, like, the fungus is still found on those bats each winter, but I don't know if you've noticed, like, the last couple summers, whenever we catch bats now, there's not even any scarring anymore on the wings of those bats. So it may just be that those bats that are remaining just doesn't affect them to the same extent. That would be my 2 cents. Who knows?
Thanks, Lauren. That was a great presentation.